everybody, and welcome to my Life Story podcast. In this first episode, I really want to tell the testimony of my life story. And to be totally honest with you, this is therapy for me, but I hope that it also touches other people and helps them feel like they're not alone if they've had similar experiences. But I will let you know ahead of time. I do talk about some difficult parts of my childhood that might be upsetting to some people. So I just wanted to give that disclaimer from the beginning. So I want to go ahead and jump right into telling you guys about my parents and my family. And that really sets the backdrop for a lot of the things that I went through. So the simplest way to describe my parents is that my dad is an alcoholic and has been my whole entire life, and my mom is mentally ill and she's chemically dependent on very serious and heavy pharmaceutical medications. But she was an alcoholic when I was younger and eventually switched off of alcohol for the most part and on to pharmaceutical medications. And so there is a lack of sobriety in my household from the beginning, and I am an only child. And that will come up a lot later in the story because I was really put in the middle of sadly two very, very broken, hurt individuals. One way to really characterize my house growing up was chaos, violence, anger, fear, and dysfunction. It was kind of strange that they didn't really parent me in a very traditional way. In many ways, I was a combination of abused and neglected, and maybe in a third dysfunctional category, they treated me as an adult and as somebody that they from time to time would need to lean on and even get advice from at a very, very young age. I remember kind of trying to counsel my mom about her marriage and sexual difficulties with my dad as young as 5 or 6 years old. I remember being very aware of their problems and what was going on in their adult world. I was always aware when there was financial problems. I was aware when they were having problems at work. It's almost as if they did not shield me from anything. And so I had, in so many ways, a very, very brief period where I could truly be a child. On the lighter end of the spectrum, I remember being really excited as a kid about hearing about Santa Claus and all of that. And, my dad burst that bubble and said, "There's no Santa. I'm Santa. He's not real." And that's something kind of lighthearted and silly. But on the more extreme end of things, I was exposed to a lot of evil, terrifying things. Everything from really, really gruesome and graphic horror movies to really, really gruesome and graphic murder documentaries that showed real dead bodies. And these were the kind of things that, in the late 90s might come on like HBO, or even documentaries at that time that you could get from seedy gas stations called like Faces of Death that would show real live death scenes of real people. So I kind of grew up in this terrifying environment in every way possible. And to add to that, like I said before, my parents were constantly fighting. And so I remember a particular time where my mom said very calmly and calculated that she was going to kill my father with the gun that was in the house, and that I would need to tell the police officers that it was an accident. And of course, as a kid, I remember being really upset and saying, "No, mom, please don't do this. Please don't do this." And thankfully, she never ended up doing that. I remember another time where my parents were essentially chasing each other through the house with scissors and maybe a knife of some sort. And I remember my mom stabbing my dad and him bleeding and me being just so upset. And I think they might have told me something like, "Oh, we're just playing." And so everything that goes along with that, yelling, screaming, punching holes in the wall. My dad would often get so drunk that he would pee in places he wasn't supposed to, like closets, the kitchen sink. I remember opening up the closet and it being like wet and smelling like urine because my dad would get so drunk. Same with my mom in the earlier years. She had a weird phase when I was in about third or fourth grade where she would be clubbing like she was a young woman, and she would get blackout drunk to the point where she was passed out And I have kind of this disturbing scene where she was like so passed out that her pants were down, and just like seeing this as a kid and it being also crazy and just being afraid because sometimes my mom wouldn't come home until really late, and it was just a mess. And I remember my parents joking about it the next day that my mom was so drunk that she went outside and peed on the front porch. And so it was just like these insane things were normalized. And even that scene where my mom was going to kill my dad, she will still occasionally joke about that as if it's something that's funny. And I think that that's another hard part. And another reason why I'm telling this story is that my reality was denied so much growing up. I learned pretty quick when I was maybe in my preteen, teen years to never try and confront my mom, especially with what I remember my childhood being like, and how she treated me, because she would get very, very upset, and she would say things like, "You were so spoiled," because I'm an only child. And she would say, "You had everything. I gave you everything. I was such a good mother." And it was like maybe she was really convinced of that. So that kind of messed me up for a long time because I think a part of me thought, oh, maybe I was spoiled. Maybe I was the bad girl. Maybe she did do a great job. So I just think even now, decades later, talking about this is so important just to get it out and to face what really happened. So, going back to my very early childhood years, there's several things that stick out to me as being particularly traumatic. One thing was my mom beating me in front of one of the neighborhood girls. I just remember feeling so much shame, but essentially what happened was my mom was exercising in the old days on her like VHS tape and TV, and my friend and I would come in through the sliding glass door that was almost like a front porch, but of an apartment. And so I do remember her telling me something to the effect of, like, don't get in my way, don't cross in front of me when I'm exercising. And so who knows? I was such a little kid, maybe like 7. I don't know if I forgot. I didn't know if I thought we could just kind of squeeze by really fast. But me and my friend crossed in front of her while she was exercising so that my friend could go home out the sliding glass door. And my mom just flipped out. She grabbed me. She was just beating me and hitting me. But what I remember standing out to me is my mom telling my friend, "Stay and watch this. You stay and watch this." And so there's just so much shame. And I'm sure that was traumatic for my little friend at the time to witness that, because who does that really? So that's one thing that comes to mind. Another thing that comes to mind that is so strange. I think some people might have a hard time believing it. But anyhow, when I was really young, my mom was the main source of love and affection in spite of how dysfunctionally she behaved. And I will say that I believe she tried. She tried to do her best. This might come out in future sessions, but my mom was very, very severely abused. And I can't help but wonder now that I know more about psychology if she ended up having something like borderline personality disorder herself. That really is what would make the most sense with her symptoms. But anyhow, she did, read to me at night. She did spend time playing with me and with my toys and like my playhouses. She did tuck me in at night and read me stories. And I would often sit in her lap in this rocking chair that was in the living room. And so my dad decided arbitrarily at a super young age, again, couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, possibly even 5, I'm not sure. But he, in a single point in time, banned me from having any physical affection from my mom. And she was not allowed to do my hair anymore. She was not allowed to tuck me in anymore. She was not allowed to basically interact with me as if I was a child anymore. She wasn't allowed to tuck me in anymore. And he just cut off. That's the only source of love and affection I had, because most of my family lived on the opposite side of the country. And I did have one set of family members in town, but we weren't close to them. So it's not like I had cousins, not like I had siblings, not like I had aunts and uncles around me. So I was really pretty isolated being an only child. And I did really lean on and look to my mom for love. And my dad cut that off and said, no more. And I just remember feeling the hurt, pain, shame, and confusion of that, and just not being able to get hugs or anything anymore. And it's really weird because it would come up years later when I was probably about 16, and my parents made a passing comment about how I'm so cold and I didn't want to hug them. And I remember thinking, you guys did this to me. You shut off any form of love and affection that I had from such a young age. You're the ones that attached this shame a physical affection to me at such a young age and pretty much traumatized me. So that's just one of those things that sticks out. And another major landmark thing that my dad did that was really upsetting is when we moved from the apartment complex to our first house when I was around third grade. I think it may have been even before the third grade year started during the summer, maybe. But he essentially threw out all of my toys. And my mom had bought me a lot of Barbies, a lot of dolls, a lot of just like learning stuff. And it almost happened in two phases because the first phase happened when my dad decided to just, again, arbitrarily get rid of all my kid stuff in the room. So I had all these Sesame Street posters. I had this big plastic playhouse thing that was like so big I could get in it and my mom could get in and out of it and all this stuff. And he just gave away all of that stuff to my upstairs neighbors that had two little girls. And he kind of said something like, "Oh, you're too big for that now." And again, mind you, I was maybe in first or second grade when this happened, but he gave it away. Like that was phase one, but I still had my Barbies. I loved Barbies so much. Barbies were my world, and just like, old fashioned dolls that I would play with. And that had, again, really been a solace to me. At one point, my mom's love was a solace to me until that got cut off. And then my next solace was being able to play and just live in this dream world in my mind. And then when we moved to our new house, my dad just threw away all my toys, and I had one toy chest just packed to the brim with toys, and he just left it there. So it was like my childhood ended before I started third grade. And again, you can go ahead and add to that all the chaos and violence and frightening things that I saw in my house, and then all the chaos and evil and frightening things I saw on videos and documentaries. So just looking back, I mean, they really messed me up. There's no other way to say it. But somehow I still functioned. And now, kind of putting back the pieces of my life together, I really think those early years that I can remember, there are some really young things that I can remember. Like, I think there may have been some abuse by a babysitter, but I'm not really sure. But some of that stuff is kind of outside of my recollection, like maybe before the age of 4 or so. But once I moved to these first apartment complexes that I'm telling you about before we moved into our first house, that's where a lot of the painful memories really come in clearly to me about some of the just really painful and traumatic things that happened. And I don't think that I've mentioned this yet, but my parents could also be very physically abusive in terms of how they beat me, how they disciplined me, how they punished me. They were both verbally abusive, emotionally abusive, and physically abusive. And so I remember getting beat with extension cords, belts, hands, getting like pinched really hard, sometimes slapped or punched as I got older. And I really was, from what I remember, a really good kid. So with my parents, it was less about disciplining me for something that I really did. It was more about me making them angry just by being around, being a kid, like that example I told you earlier of just walking in front of my mom while she was doing a workout video was enough for her to physically attack me. So there's a lot of pain there too. Something else that comes to mind was also the fear of abandonment. A lot of times, my mom would threaten to leave me. So during the time period when our first house was being built, my mom would constantly tell me, "Oh, I'm going to leave and you're going to have to stay with your dad." And since she was always complaining about him and talking bad about him and almost trying to put me on her side against him, I was, of course, like, "No, no, please don't do it. Please don't do it." And so it was just this really awkward triangle of wanting my dad's love, but I haven't talked really much about him yet. He was very angry and very scary, to be honest. And then wanting my mom's love, and she could, I would say, I don't know what the proportion is, maybe 50-50. Sometimes she was sweet and caring, and then other times she wasn't. Another memory comes to mind that just kind of illustrates this. I remember having gotten some kind of money. I don't know if it was like for my birthday or for Christmas or something, because I did have some family members that lived on the opposite side of the country that would always send me cards for every holiday with like a little bit of money in it. And that was sweet. I'm grateful for that. But I remember us being in some kind of little store, and I wanted to buy my mom something that was like, I thought it was really beautiful. And I think according to my mom, according to the story I remember, she must have said that she liked something different. But I got this really pretty, I think it was some kind of like angel blue stone thing that you like hang from your little car windshield mirror. It's like this little decorative thing. I just thought it was so beautiful. And so I bought it for my mom and I was so excited to show it to her. And she got mad at me in the store and was like, "You didn't get that because it's something that I wanted. I said that I liked this other thing. You just got that because that's what you wanted." So it was just most of my childhood, I feel like, in one way or another, was spent with people misunderstanding my motives and my intentions and my heart. And I feel like my parents have been pretty notorious for that throughout my life. And so just there was just so much pain and shame and rejection with my parents just from the beginning. Although, again, I will say, I do think my mom tried to be a good mom. I think she was just so broken from her own super, super traumatic childhood that she just couldn't, for the life of her, do the right things and be appropriate as a mom. Another story that comes to mind, this is once we moved into the house finally and both my parents moved. I remember it being found out that my mom had been having an affair and she got pregnant with the man. And I remember her telling me as a little kid that she was going to have an abortion. And so if you can imagine a third grader, maybe I was in fourth grade by that time, I'm not sure, learning, first of all, like what is pregnancy and then what's abortion, killing, your little brother or sister. And I remember telling her, "Mom, you're killing my little brother or sister," and just feeling the weight of that. Can you imagine telling that to a child? But she would often turn to me as if I was another adult and she would just really like lean on me and kind of like suck the life out of me, kind of like a vampire. But I think I was just so desperate for like love, attention, and affirmation. I would try to be that counselor for her. And just again, once we moved, there was just more fighting, more violence, more times where my dad was punching holes in walls. My dad would also embarrass me a lot. He would occasionally scream at the neighborhood kids because you know how kids will be kids and they'll kind of tattle on each other, they'll have issues. Well, my dad took it upon himself to just yell and scream and rant and rave at the neighborhood kids. So that was really embarrassing because we were actually in a fairly respectable middle class neighborhood with a fairly respectable school that was right across the street, walking distance. And so we had kind of moved from the somewhat sketchy side of town to the basically nice, respectable side of town. So as you can imagine, there was a lot of parents that didn't want me anywhere near their kids. And it was really hurtful too, because essentially from at least third grade on, I massively got bullied and made fun of by my peers. So it was like I could not win. Home was scary, or I was being neglected. School was scary, or I was being made fun of. I wasn't really very popular with my teachers. And now looking back, I think the neglect really showed, but kids are mean. And so I remember around that third grade, fourth grade time that my clothes would be dirty, they would be stained. I was not taken to the dentist or the doctor. I didn't see a dentist until I was around 18. And so I was a mess. And, as an African American, we have a certain texture of hair that really needs to be cared for. And since my dad had basically prohibited my mom from doing my hair anymore, I was trying to like manage fairly difficult hair at a really young age. Or maybe they would get my braids done, but then wouldn't get them redone for like 4 months. And so the kids would make fun of it. And I was really usually one of the only Black people in my class. And so I was made fun of for my lips, my nose, my teeth, my hair, everything. And then I think I can only imagine, but I think I was peculiar to say the least around other kids. I had just already seen so much. I had not been socialized very well for the lack of brothers and sisters, the lack of cousins to play with, the kind of strange experiences with neighborhood kids, like having my friends see me beat, I think I really probably repelled people. I was probably a bit strange and off and awkward. And so that was really painful, really, really painful. I also remember being hungry a lot. I have this distinct memory of talking to my dad and saying, "Dad, can you please get me a cheeseburger?" Because, again, this is the late 90s. I remember even back then, cheeseburgers were like $1, and kids' meals are really cheap. And, I knew that. And so I said, Dad, can you just spend $1 to get me a cheeseburger? And he's like, no, if I spend that money, I won't have money to get my beer and cigarettes. And so it was really clear to me that, my needs were at the bottom of the list. And I just remember being hungry. And so from a young age, I started stealing from gas stations, stealing from the teacher's candy jars. I remember sneaking back into the classroom at recess and stealing kids' snacks. Off and on throughout school, I wouldn't have enough lunch money, so I'd have to go around and like beg people, like, "Hey, can you give me $1 and this and that?" And so that was something that was a problem, and kind of I think ended up setting me up with a lot of food issues and sugar and carb issues later in life. But that's a whole another story. But there was just so much fear all the time. And then around this time, my parents arguing really got out of control. And my both of my parents tended to work weird hours. And so I think that my dad might have worked the night shift for a while and then the mid shift. Because I just remember by the time I would come home, my dad would still be sleeping on the couch and he would yell and scream and rant and rave if I woke him up, because he had to get up and go to work later. And then there was a separate time in that mix where my mom ended up going on the night shift. So she was gone, all night long. And then she would be completely asleep and like knocked out in the mornings, by the time she was home. That's another strange thing about my childhood. My parents were often sleeping at a time when they should have been awake and taking care of me. And it was just really kind of messed up. I don't know how else to describe it. So either I was tiptoeing around, trying not to wake up my parents, or they were awake and stressed or fighting, ranting, raving, and screaming. Or maybe we were having a somewhat peaceful time watching TV together, but they were watching something traumatizing that kids should never be exposed to, should never see. Or maybe if my mom was in a friendlier mood, she was trying to use me as her best friend or counselor, telling me super inappropriate things about her, boyfriends, sex life, affairs, problems with my dad. So it was a mess. And by the time I was in third grade, I had already felt like my childhood was completely over. Really sadly, I remember a new girl moving into the house next door and her having dolls, and she was so innocent. We were the same age. And me just feeling like I remember consciously thinking, like, I can never be that again. I tried to play Barbies with her, but it just didn't feel right. Because I think I already had so much shame associated with everything that should be natural or normal. Hugs and affection should be natural and normal. I was shamed about that and forbidden to do that. Playing with Barbies and dolls is so natural and normal for a little kid, but I was shamed about that. I was shamed so much for my appearance and for my features that there was just so much shame. And so I just remember the sadness and the grief of losing something that I loved so much. I loved Barbies and dolls so much and just losing all of that. Another sad thing that comes to mind that is a lot of loss has been how my parents dealt with pets. A lot of times they would take on strays, but they would not fully take care of them, just like they were not fully taking care of me. And then they would dump them in the middle of a neighborhood somewhere. And I just remember the grief and sadness of constantly getting attached to these little animals and then having them dumped somewhere and just thinking they're probably dead. I do think looking back, some trauma symptoms were evident from a young age. I had so many nightmares. I was still wetting the bed off and on, up through second grade. I had sort of tics where I would like scrunch my nose up, or I would just like compulsively lick my lips until there were scabs all around my mouth. I would grind my teeth really, really loud. And I don't know if I heard him mention this, but I had insane nightmares. And some things could almost be described as a type of night terror. I remember being in around second grade and looking down at the floor, and it was like the whole floor was swarming and moving with bugs. And I could see it with my open eyes, but it wasn't there when I would turn on the lights. And I just remember being so afraid of so many things and having so little comfort. I remember seeing terrifying movies like it as just such a little kid, and it just being so scared to go to sleep, scared to be alone. But there was little to no comfort to be found with my parents. So I think I'll stop here for this first part of my testimony and my life story. And there is much more to come. Thank you guys for listening. Bye for now.